Welcome to Past Capture channel. Every image here holds a forgotten moment from the past. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.
This photograph was taken around 1934-1935 in New York and shows Margaret Bourke White high above the Chrysler Building, where she had previously maintained her own studio. She was sitting more than 240 meters above the street on one of the building's famous metal eagles while taking photographs, at a time when modern safety equipment was virtually non-existent. The photograph was taken by Oscar Graubner, her assistant, making this essentially a photograph of a photographer while she was taking a photograph. Bourke White later became one of the first major photographers for Life magazine, documenting the Soviet Union, World War II, and the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp. In 1948, she also photographed Mahatma Gandhi just hours before his assassination, creating one of the most famous images of her career. The controversial part is that she repeatedly placed herself in locations considered extremely dangerous and unconventional for a woman in the 1930s, constantly pushing the line between professional courage and recklessness. The woman sitting above New York in this photograph would eventually take her camera from America's skyscrapers into wars, dictatorships, and some of the most important events of the 20th century. London, 1937. This photograph captures Charing Cross Road just 2 years before the outbreak of World War II. The Marks & Co. sign on the left belonged to the famous bookshop at number 84, the same store later made world famous by the book 84 Charing Cross Road. The photograph was taken by Wolfgang Suschisky, a photographer who documented everyday London before the war and later moved into filmmaking. Even the small Dr. Patterson's Pills advertisement offers a glimpse into the strange commercial and medical culture of the era. But the most striking part is that the people in this picture had no idea that within 2 years, Britain would enter a war that would transform their lives forever. This same city would soon experience blackouts, the Blitz, bombing raids, and years of hardship. But here, London still appears to be living its ordinary life. That is what makes this photograph so powerful. Without showing a single battlefield or soldier, it captures London in the final moments of normal life before one of history's darkest storms.
This photo is from the 1912 French Grand Prix in Dieppe, France, a race held on public roads rather than a modern circuit, with cars passing spectators at speeds exceeding 110 kilometers per hour. Held on June 25th and 26th, the race was won by French driver Georges Boyot in a Peugeot. But the real story behind the image is the shocking danger of early motor racing. During the race, riding mechanic Jean Bassignano was killed in a crash, while an unnamed spectator was also fatally struck by a piece of a car's wheel. American driver David Bruce Brown dominated the first day, finishing more than 2 minutes ahead and looking like the likely winner. But after a mechanical problem forced him to take fuel outside the permitted area, officials disqualified him, handing Boyot a dramatic victory. Even Jules Gu and Ralph De Palma were disqualified for illegal refueling, proving that a single mistake could erase hours of racing. What makes this photograph so striking is that it captures an era when Grand Prix racing had almost none of today's safety barriers, and the distance between being a spectator and becoming a victim could be just a few meters.
This photograph dates from the 1930s, when radar as we know it did not yet exist, and armies had to literally listen to the sky for enemy aircraft. The device, most likely a Dutch acoustic listening system, used 2 large parabolic dishes to collect the sound of an aircraft engine and direct it toward the operator's ears. By comparing the sound reaching each ear, the operator could estimate the aircraft's direction and pass the information to anti-aircraft defenses. But here's the crazy part. Sound traveled much slower than the aircraft itself, meaning a plane several kilometers away could move hundreds of meters before its engine noise even reached the listener. Wind, temperature, background noise, and altitude could also seriously reduce the accuracy of these strange war ears. When radar emerged in the mid-1930s, acoustic detection quickly became obsolete because aircraft could now be detected with radio waves instead of human hearing. In other words, this photograph captures a bizarre moment in military history when finding an enemy bomber meant putting a soldier on duty with two giant dishes strapped around his ears.
This old library in Cincinnati opened in 1874, but the strange part is that the building was never meant to be a library. It was originally planned as an opera house before the failed project was turned into a library. Its multi-level shelves, narrow walkways, and enormous collection made it one of the most spectacular libraries in America. The building was originally designed for about 300,000 volumes, but by 1955, the collection had grown to roughly 1.5 million books, and the building simply could not handle them anymore. The problem wasn't just a lack of space. Poor ventilation, fire concerns, and even flooding in the basement made storing so many books increasingly dangerous. Despite its incredible architectural and historical value, officials chose to move the books to a new building and demolish the old library in 1955. The controversial part is that this once famous architectural masterpiece was not destroyed by war or disaster. It was ultimately sacrificed because there were simply too many books. Today, only a few decorative elements and pieces of its stained glass survive, while this photograph preserves a glimpse of the extraordinary library that once held millions of books.
This photograph shows a lamplighter whose job was to light and maintain gas-powered street lamps in the late 19th century. But here is the controversial part. Despite what is widely claimed online, there is no solid evidence proving that this photograph was taken in Ireland in 1898. The vehicles visible in the background have even led some researchers to question whether the commonly repeated 1898 date is correct. Lamplighting was a serious urban job at the time, with workers following assigned routes to light the lamps at night and extinguish them in the morning. In some cities, lamplighters worked every day of the week, meaning that nighttime street lighting depended directly on their daily work. What makes the image even more fascinating is that electricity was already beginning to replace gas, slowly making the lamplighter's profession obsolete.
This photograph shows New York City around 1940, when elevated trains were still running above the streets of Manhattan. The massive structure overhead was part of the 3rd Avenue Elevated Railway, which had operated since 1878, before being permanently shut down and demolished in 1955. The famous Duffy's Tavern sign can also be seen, a name connected not only to taverns, but also to one of America's most popular comedy radio shows of the era. The surprising part is that the tavern in the radio show was fictional, and its mysterious owner, Mr. Duffy, was never actually seen. The main character, Archie, managed the tavern and constantly spoke to the unseen Duffy over the telephone, becoming one of the show's signature jokes. Only about 15 years later, those elevated trains that once symbolized modern New York were gone, pushed aside by the subway and changing economics. So this image captures the final years of a New York filled with elevated trains, radio comedy, and crowded streets, just before the city's skyline and daily life changed forever.
This photo was taken in San Francisco in 1947, about 10 years after the Golden Gate Bridge opened. It was photographed by Max Yavno, showing a worker carrying out maintenance high above the bridge. The surprising part is that painting the bridge was never just about making it look good. Fog, moisture, and salt from the Pacific constantly threatened its steel. The bridge's famous color, international orange, originally came from the protective coating on the steel, but architect Irving Morrow convinced officials to keep it. The U.S. Navy had even suggested painting the bridge yellow and black to make it more visible, but the idea was rejected. Even more controversial, the original paint contained large amounts of lead, leading to a decades-long effort to remove the old lead-based coatings. So this isn't simply a picture of a man painting a bridge. It captures the dangerous and surprisingly controversial story behind maintaining one of the world's most famous landmarks.
This photograph was taken in Nottingham, England, during the First World War, when the shortage of male workers pushed women into unusual and dangerous jobs. These women were professional window cleaners, using tall ladders to clean the windows of buildings along the street. The controversial part was that working at such heights was considered genuinely dangerous at the time, and seeing women doing this kind of work was highly unusual. The name George Webster can be seen on the building, connected to businesses involving ladders and window cleaning in Nottingham. With millions of British men away fighting, the war began breaking many traditional boundaries between men's work and women's work. These women were not simply filling empty jobs. Some were taking on work that carried serious physical risks. That makes this more than a photograph of window cleaners. It captures a moment when women were doing whatever it took to keep everyday life running during wartime.
This is a genuine self-portrait of Frank Sinatra, taken in 1938, when he was still an unknown 22-year-old living in Hoboken, New Jersey. At the time, he was still years away from becoming one of America's most famous singers. What makes the photo even more unusual is that Sinatra had been taking a series of personal self-portraits before he joined the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, decades before selfies became a thing. But here's the controversial part. That same year, Sinatra was arrested in New Jersey on charges of seduction and adultery, and his police booking photo still exists today. The charges were eventually dismissed, and he was never convicted in the case. At the time, he was still a struggling young singer, performing at the Rustic Cabin in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. So this photo captures Sinatra before the fame, before the legend, and at a time when his life was already beginning to attract controversy.
This photograph was taken on January 5, 1911, by British photographer Herbert George Ponting during the expedition to Antarctica. The two men inside the grotto were T. Griffith Taylor, a geologist, and Charles Wright, a physicist, while the ship Terra Nova can be seen in the distance. Ponting described the interior as filled with remarkable blue, green, and violet colors, and considered it one of the most beautiful scenes he encountered in Antarctica. The darker story is that this photograph belonged to the same expedition that would become tied to the deadly race between Scott and Amundsen to reach the South Pole. Scott's party reached the pole on January 17, 1912, only to discover that Roald Amundsen had arrived 34 days earlier. Scott and his 4 companions died during the return journey, and their bodies were found months later, along with their photographs and records.
In the summer of 1969, around 500,000 people descended on a farm in Bethel, New York, for the legendary Woodstock Festival, far beyond the expected crowd of about 50,000. What was supposed to be a paid music festival became essentially free after the fences were broken down, creating a serious financial crisis for the organizers. Traffic became so extreme that some performers had to be flown to the festival site by helicopter. Heavy rain, mud, shortages of food and sanitation, and widespread drug use made Woodstock far more chaotic than its later image of peace and love suggests. Yet roughly 400,000 to 500,000 people gathered without a major outbreak of violence, becoming one of the defining stories of Woodstock. Among the 32 major performances, artists such as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Santana, and The Who helped create music history. And perhaps the most surprising detail is that Woodstock wasn't actually held in Woodstock. This photograph captures the birth of one of the most enduring cultural symbols of 1960s America.
In 1985, Ebony magazine published a strange feature trying to predict what famous stars might look like in the year 2000. For a 40-year-old Michael Jackson, artist Nathan Wright imagined a completely different and relatively ordinary-looking face, predicting that he would appear more mature and distinguished. The controversial part is that the real Michael Jackson underwent dramatic changes in appearance by the year 2000 and looked almost nothing like this prediction. The magazine also predicted that Jackson's fan base would multiply several times by 2000, a prediction that, unlike the imagined face, turned out to be remarkably accurate. Interestingly, this page actually comes from the August 1985 issue of Ebony, not 1983, meaning it was published only a few years into Jackson's explosive rise to global fame. During those years, events such as his Pepsi commercial accident and major changes in his appearance turned Jackson into one of the most controversial celebrities in the world. Today, the page is more than a failed prediction. It is a fascinating snapshot of how the media of the 1980s imagined the future face and fame of Michael Jackson.
Soviet Union, the same year he entered university to study law. At the time, almost nobody could have imagined that this ordinary-looking young man would eventually become one of the world's most powerful and controversial political figures. As a teenager, Putin became deeply interested in martial arts, especially judo and sambo, which later became an important part of his public image. The more controversial part of his story is that he had already developed an interest in Soviet security work and eventually joined the KGB in 1975. He later spent years working as an intelligence officer in East Germany, taking him far from the life of an ordinary young student in Leningrad. When this photograph was taken, Putin had no political power, and his future was still completely uncertain. That is what makes the image so fascinating today. An unknown young man in 1970 who would decades later become a figure capable of influencing world politics. This photograph was taken on July 11, 1945, as the massive Queen Mary entered New York Harbor carrying 14,526 American troops returning from Europe. But the shocking part is that the end of the war in Europe did not mean the end of their military service. Many were still expected to be sent to the Pacific to fight Japan. The Queen Mary, once a luxury passenger liner, had been transformed during the war into a giant troop transport and continued playing a major role in bringing servicemen home. The effort to bring millions of American personnel back was so enormous that it became known as Operation Magic Carpet, a massive repatriation campaign that lasted for months. Even coming home became controversial, as changing discharge rules and the military point system led some soldiers to protest delays and possible redeployment. So the thousands packed onto this ship were not necessarily all returning to a peaceful civilian life. Many still faced an uncertain military future.
On August 26, 1933, a giant manta ray was reportedly caught near Deal, New Jersey, with newspapers claiming it weighed more than 5,000 pounds, or about 2,270 kilograms. The creature became tangled in the boat's line while its crew was fishing for bluefish, and the struggle reportedly lasted for about 3 hours. Reports claimed that the Coast Guard became involved and that as many as 22 rifle shots were fired to stop the animal. The carcass was taken to Brielle, New Jersey, where crowds lined up to see the so-called sea monster and paid to view it. The story became such a sensation that the display reportedly earned enough money to help fund a new fire truck for the time. But here is the controversial part. The creature shown in this famous photograph was probably not the actual manta ray, but a reconstructed display model.
This photograph is sometimes mislabeled as showing an Empire State Building worker in 1925, but it was actually taken on September 29, 1930, during the skyscraper's construction in New York City.
The unidentified worker is suspended from a crane high above Manhattan at a time when construction safety standards were far less advanced than they are today. Construction of the Empire State Building began on March 17, 1930, and the tower was completed roughly 410 days later in 1931. The Chrysler Building can be seen in the background, symbolizing the fierce race to build the world's tallest skyscraper. With 102 floors, the Empire State Building became the tallest building in the world when it was completed and held the title for decades. The shocking part is that many workers faced extreme heights and deadly conditions while working with far fewer safety protections than modern crews. This photograph, often labeled "Man with a Hippopotamus Carriage 1924, is believed to show Lotus, the famous hippopotamus associated with the Al G. Barnes Circus. Lotus had been with the circus since 1919 and eventually became one of its major attractions. The circus promoted him with exaggerated titles such as the largest performing hippopotamus in the world to attract crowds. During the 1920s, large circus animals were not always kept inside exhibition grounds. They were sometimes taken into streets and parades as living advertisements. The Barnes Circus also operated a major animal collection in Culver City, California, where the hippopotamus was one of the star attractions. The shocking part is that an enormous wild animal was actually used for public displays and street promotion, something that would raise serious animal welfare concerns today.
This photograph is connected to Operation Baby Lift in the final days of the Vietnam War in April 1975, when thousands of Vietnamese children were evacuated to the United States and other countries for adoption. The photo was taken on April 12, 1975, as the children were being transported from Clark Air Base in the Philippines to Los Angeles. Just 8 days earlier, a U.S. military C-5 aircraft carrying children crashed, killing around 78 children, yet the evacuation operation continued. The most controversial part of the story was that not all of these children were necessarily orphans. Some still had parents or relatives in Vietnam. Some were children of American servicemen and Vietnamese women, and many later faced complicated questions about identity, family, and their origins. Around 2,800 children were evacuated, but some had incomplete records, and decades later, some began searching for their birth families and original identities. Today, this photo is more than an image of children being rescued from war. For many of them, it represents the moment their new lives began, while their past and families were left behind. This photograph was taken in Paris in the summer of 1944, shortly after France was liberated from Nazi German occupation. These women had been accused of collaborating with the Germans and were publicly humiliated in front of crowds. Head shaving became a symbolic punishment, especially for women accused of having relationships with German soldiers. But the controversial truth is that not all of these women actually had such relationships, and some were punished based on rumors, revenge, or personal grudges. In some cases, women were paraded through the streets partially naked, with humiliating marks painted on their bodies or faces. Around 20,000 French women are estimated to have had their heads shaved or suffered similar punishments, often without a formal trial. Ironically, French women gained the right to vote that same year, meaning political progress for women happened alongside one of the darkest forms of public gender-based humiliation.